What's going on YouTube? It's Teach back again with another video, and today we're talking about the Atlanta Falcons in our season preview series. Hopefully you all enjoyed today's video. If you do, be sure to hit that like button, help me out a ton. If you're new around here, want to see more football content, the rest of our series, be sure to hit that big red subscribe button. And this is just the beginning of a conversation. Tell me what you think about the Atlanta Falcons down below in the comments section. How many wins do you think this team can get? Who are some X factors, some difference makers you think could come to arise on this young team? And what are some games you're looking forward to see this team play? I responded to just about every comment, so let's talk about the Falcons down below. Second video in this series, so I'm not going to try to rehash too much, but there's certain things I'm going to hit on again. If you did miss the first video in this series, go back and hear about my thoughts on the Arizona Cardinals. So let's start things off with my win range, my projected win total, and I'll kind of talk about where I think this team is at right now. So 2 to 5 wins feels about right. 2 wins my projected win total. That does feel low. It's I don't say it's hard to be that bad because, like, you know, lift up a college football team, put them in the NFL. That's a winless team. And we've seen winless teams before, but, you know, 2 wins is probably selling the Falcons short. That's just how it came together in my way too early season preview series, and maybe they're in that 3 to 4 win mark. 5 would kind of surprise me. Now, you know, granted, this team did win 7 games last year with a scoring differential worse than the Detroit Lions, so, you know, sometimes record doesn't tell the entire story, but this is a rough football team that really only got worse in a lot of ways. There were some upgrades, and, you know, you'd think AJ Terrell is going to be better in year 3, and there's things to be optimistic about in Atlanta, but this is one of the weaker teams in the NFL in my eyes, and a contender for the number 1 overall pick. So, you know, looking at the actual roster, Marcus Mariota, Desmond Ridder, those two feel very comparable. We'll talk about Ridder in just a moment, but Mariota does raise the floor a little bit of the offense, but at the same time, he's been a backup for a reason the last couple of years, and more than likely, he's not going to be as good as Matt Ryan, though his mobility does help some of the weaknesses on the offensive line, which, you know, has some things to be excited about. You know, like Chris Lindstrom's been a really big hit, but, you know, Caleb McGarry, that's a bit of a miss. Jalen Mayfield was rough last year. Still trying to figure out that center position post Alex Mack. So things to figure out there on the offensive line. They took a pretty big step back last year. I'm intrigued by this wide receiver room. We'll talk about a couple of those guys later, but Kyle Pitts is a stud. He's going to grab more than 1 touchdown this year. And I'm really excited about Drake London, their first-round pick this year. Never had a problem with his route running, and you go back and look at any of my, draft content. Never had a qualm with his route running, and for a guy that size to be able to move that well after the catch, it's Brandon Marshall-esque. Now, I don't think he brings a whole lot when it comes to, you know, being a downfield weapon, but at the same time, 6'4" plays, if he's got the time to get downfield, there's some potential maybe he does develop as a guy who can add that contested catch, that 50-50, tool into his arsenal. But I think right away you're getting a guy who's hard to bring down, big in size, and can win from the line of scrimmage 20 yards up. And I think that's, you know, a step in the right direction for the Atlanta Falcons. Then switching sides, pass rush is a huge concern. I mean, it has been the past couple of years. Grady Jarrett, a stud, but it's felt like a one-man show. Linebacking position, you lose Foye Oluokun. That's a pretty big loss. Does that mean, Trey Anderson step into a starting role? Potentially. Also, Deion Jones, a guy we've heard potentially being a cut candidate in camp, a trade candidate. Makes a lot of money for a team that's not going to win a lot of games. And those two things don't always go hand in hand with one another unless you're getting draft capital in return. But in this case, Jones signed that contract a few years ago, so he may not be sticking around either. Then the secondary, obviously, like, AJ Terrell is one of the best cornerbacks in football, as is. So that was a huge step forward he took last year in year 2. And then you add Casey Hayward, we'll talk about later, and Richie Grant's a really intriguing piece, and that kind of leads me into my realistic goal for this team. So realistic versus reach, pretty straightforward. Realistic is something I think this team and all teams can accomplish once I get to their video. And then reach goal is kind of like that reach school that you applied to when you were looking at colleges, or that reach job that you're not totally qualified to get, but you take a shot on it anyways, just in case maybe they do see something in you or your resume or whatever the case may be. So realistic, I think every goal I set for all these teams is within, the margin for error. But, reach is, maybe the high side of variance. You're getting, a little wish fulfillment there. But, realistic goal for this team has got to be, because I think within a 2-year rebuild, I mean, them, Seattle, there are a couple of these teams, Chicago with how much cap space they have next year, Atlanta's in that same boat. 2 years is what feels like a lifetime in the NFL in a lot of, 2 years is kind of what we're giving rookie quarterbacks nowadays, right? So if you can find those realistic building blocks, I want to find guys, if I'm a Falcons fan, I want to find guys on this team that I know I'm going to sign to a second contract, and that, hey, let's say in 5 years we're in our Super Bowl window, who on this roster will still be there? And, maybe that's Richie Grant, a guy who I liked a lot. I thought they got as a really good value at the top of the second round, and not this past draft, but the draft before that, kind of like a guy we'll talk about here in a little bit. But maybe he takes a step forward and kind of lives up to his hype after a big Senior Bowl and a really solid career at UCF. Maybe he does take that step forward, and boom, there you go. Another young piece there in the secondary that you can plan on having around. Maybe it is Trey Anderson, day 2 selection there at that inside linebacker position, who's played literally almost everywhere during his, high school to college, tenure playing football, but also an unbelievable athlete. Definitely some moldable clay. And then a couple of the rookie edge rushers we'll talk about later. And then on the offensive line, maybe it's Jalen Mayfield piecing together. Maybe Caleb McGarry kind of takes a step forward. I mean, we're kind of deep in his career. That's, not always something that's realistic, but maybe he kind of figures it out and he becomes, that other bookend tackle for the Falcons. And then, I haven't even mentioned Cordero Patterson. Maybe you see him, if he does it again this year, towards the end of last year, it felt like they were a little afraid to go to him more often. And I don't know why. I mean, he was part of the best things about the Falcons in the early part of the season. Part of it's, the novelty of, that guy used to be a receiver, now he's a running back, he's pretty good. But I think there's something legitimate to build upon there. So finding those, pieces. Now, Cordero Patterson versus the other people we talked about, he's a little older and, he may not still be playing in 5 years for that example. So he may not be the best person to look to, but, is it Drake London hitting the ground running? Is it one of these wide receivers we're about to talk about? But first, let me talk about my reach goal. So with Desmond Ridder, it can break into a couple different, categories of what counts as hitting, right? It's a subjective term. And really, I'm talking about the latter rather than the former. But first, he could just look good. Maybe he's, starting by week 6, just an arbitrary, part of the schedule. Maybe he's starting by then and has a couple games. You're like, okay, there might be something there. And then, the rest is kind of meh. Okay, well, maybe we'll give him the Davis Mills treatment, give him a full year to start, and we'll use our, top 5 pick and go get a Will Anderson or, a Jalen Carter or, one of these top tier non-quarterbacks in next year's draft class and just improve our roster as a whole. All right, that's interesting. That's what we just saw the Texans do. Let's draft a Derek Stingley and let's just wait on the quarterback position. That could be in play. Now, the ultimate, I think this team's not going to win the Super Bowl. Sorry, Atlanta Falcons fans. They're not going to the Super Bowl. The next most successful and biggest hit they could have this year is having Desmond Ridder develop into this franchise quarterback they can move forward completely with. Davis Mills is definitely the exception to the rule. Not often are third-round quarterbacks eventually becoming starters by year 2. It's definitely a rarity. And for Ridder, he's one of these guys where, it's hard to say this for him because me and so many others around draft time were saying, he's the most NFL ready. But, it's interesting to see what that ceiling will be. But I think if you had to start and operate an offense day 1, Desmond Ridder would be the guy I would want. And because of that, that's intriguing. But maybe he's more than that, right? Like, plenty of draft pundits have been wrong, right? And a lot of people who are fans of the draft have been wrong before. So maybe Desmond Ridder is more than that, right? Maybe he's that guy who can step in and be pretty good. But then there's more to it, especially with, maybe those big receivers around him, got to elevate and bring him to another level. Because, Ridder's big knock on him is he can be accurate. You just don't always see it. There's just times where it comes and goes. Maybe having, a 6'5" tight end / wide receiver in Kyle Pitts, a 6'4" guy in Drake London, a 6'5" dude in on tape. Maybe that takes away some of those concerns. But long tangent aside, if Ridder goes beyond that Davis Mills, tier and really showcases, hey, I can be your franchise quarterback, not only then are you saying, hey, we're going to have a top 5 pick, we're going to draft a guy we think is one of the best players in this draft, and we think we might have something at quarterback, right? Like the Texans, and then honestly, the Texans, most people, if you're a Texans fan, let me know what you think, but you're not really looking at Davis Mills saying, that's my franchise guy. It's set, the set is sailed, You're really looking at that and like, yeah, well, maybe. We'll write it out for a year, and we'll figure it out in a better quarterback class. For Ridder, if he can go beyond that and showcase, hey, I'm the guy who can lead your offense, then you're saying, hey, we got a top 5 pick and our franchise quarterback, and you're kind of getting closer to Cincinnati Bengals territory, right, where Joe Burrow gets hurt midway through his rookie year, and because of that, obviously they're not as good thereafter, and they get a top 5 pick and get to add a guy like Jamar Chase. And it's like, hey, we got a top 5 pick, and we know our franchise quarterback. And that is just pure nirvana right there. So that would be, again, short of winning the Super Bowl, which I don't see in the cards for the Falcons. That could be the biggest accomplishment this team could have this upcoming year. Now, it's a reach goal for a reason. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if it did, wow, that would change the complete complexion around this Falcons team, because them, look at that Matt Ryan trade. They were kind of cornered into this rebuild because they're eyeing Deshaun Watson. Ryan wants to believe it's the biggest dead cap hit in NFL history, but because of that, they got money to spend next year. Just like the Bears, they move on from Khalil Mack, dead money this year, but next year, greener grounds to play on. So it'll be interesting to see. just because of, how quick you might be able to turn around this entire roster, just complete this turnaround and this rebuild, if Desmond Ridder is more than what he has been, hyped up and perceived as. So let's move on to some X factors now. Bryan Edwards, Auden Tate. I normally put down one player here, but I am cheating on a couple of these pinpoints just because they're kind of camp battles-ish, more so for this first one. I just want to know who that other outside receiver is going to be, right? Like Drake London's probably going to play on the outside. You'll see some Kyle Pitts there, but he can also play inline and tight end. Drake London can also do some stuff from the slot. That'd be interesting to see. But Olamide Zaccheaus, not been anything special. So Bryan Edwards, and maybe it is and Auden Tate rather than or Auden Tate, but both these guys have an opportunity, and they're kind of coming from different situations. For Bryan Edwards, especially last year, it's like, okay, he had some big moments late in games where you kind of remember those plays a little bit longer. But maybe this guy going into year 3, he takes another step forward. It's from the East Coast, maybe that helps him as well. And then Auden Tate is just one of these guys where kind of like Tim Patrick a couple of years ago, and James Washington, where it's like, dude, Tim Patrick's your number 4 receiver. That's a nice luxury. James Washington's your number 4 wideout. That must be nice. Auden Tate last year, you got him as your 4 behind Jamar Chase, D. Higgins, Tyler Boyd. That must be nice. That's cool to have. Well, now he's got a chance to start, and I am just beyond obviously he's the number 4 receiver for a reason because he's not as good as those other 3, but those other 3 might be the best trio in football. So, what does he look like in a chance to just start? And if it is Auden Tate, again, it's the Monstars. I mean, it's Kyle Pitts, it's 6'4" Drake London, it's 6'5" Auden Tate. That is unreal. And, for Marcus Mariota, Desmond Ridder, maybe you forget whatever, Arthur Smith's calling, y'all run verticals. I'm going to throw it up to the rim. Come down with this 50-50 ball for me. Not literally, but that would be interesting in and of itself. Like, I don't know if I've ever seen a wide receiver room that big. And, like, how does, a play caller, Arthur Smith, and a quarterback, Mariota or Ridder, how do you take advantage of that fully? That's fascinating, and for a non-Falcons fan, that's worth watching in and of itself. But if it's Bryan Edwards, it's kind of interesting. I don't know if he's necessarily a deep threat, but a guy that maybe adds another layer to it, right? If you have Drake London being your guy who wins, from the line of scrimmage, 15 yards out, line of scrimmage, 20 yards out, maybe Edwards can be in that 15 to 30 window, get a little bit more depth out of him. But like I said, had some big moments last year for the Raiders, and sometimes just a little bit of a change in scenery and a change in expectations too. He was going from a Raiders team last year that made the playoffs, right? And now he's going to a team that's in a full rebuild. This is a chance to play loose, play relaxed, and maybe to get another gear out of him. So switching sides of the ball now, let's go ahead and talk about these rookie defensive linemen. Arnold Ebiketie, the man in the picture. Guy I thought they got a great value on, right? Like, there was late first-round buzz around this guy. Comes from a school that produces athletes. He's a stellar athlete. And Odafe Owe, the year prior, the knock on him was, no sacks. Where's that production? Ebiketie really didn't have that issue. Maybe he needs to learn a couple more moves and find a little bit more consistent. But I mean, what college player is not having to, learn and adjust and grow in those areas once they get to the NFL? I mean, everybody's having to do that. So what's different about Ebiketie? So I think they got a great value, addressed a position of need, and it's just kind of when you make an X chart of that value, both with the pick, but also based off of where your roster is at, it just kind of lined up perfectly there for Ebiketie, but also D'Angelo Malone, a guy who, maybe you haven't heard of. He's a day 3 pick, a 5th rounder for a reason, but there are plenty of people, saying he should have gone earlier. He's got fans in his corner, which is really interesting, and, not a guy I talked about a whole lot during the draft, but high motor, works hard, smaller school guy, so maybe a little bit of a transition as he makes his way to the NFL, but an intriguing shot in the dark. And again, in the 5th round, I mean, as good a time you're going to get to draft that guy. And for a team that needs edge rushers, if one of these 2 guys works into a starting role and you feel confident starting them, that's a win. And you're talking about your 2nd round pick and your 5th round pick following, drafting a wide receiver in the 1st and a quarterback in the 3rd. Value all over this draft class, and huge fan of that and that perspective of it. But because of that, those are the type of seeds that lead to a team turning it around and kind of piecing it all together. So I think the Falcons, after being cornered into a rebuild during that Matt Ryan, Deshaun Watson situation, I think they handled the draft really well. And because of that, I'm really fascinated to see what Ebiketie and D'Angelo Malone kind of grow into. And the last one I want to talk about is Casey Hayward, and obviously he's the oldest of the bunch here. But this guy who, first half of last year was as good a value coming out of free agency as there was. He was playing great for the Raiders, took a step back, but still one of the best cornerbacks from last year per, Pro Football Focus grading. And that being said, a lot of his success in his career with the Chargers and even last year with the Raiders came attached to Gus Bradley, the defensive coordinator he's played a lot under. So once, Gus Bradley was hired by the Colts, I was thinking it's a done deal. Casey Hayward's going to Indianapolis. He doesn't. He goes to Atlanta. Now he's been playing under Dean Pease, this really crafty blitzer. Okay, well, he could play man, he could play zone. Okay, let's see what this looks like. But because this is a departure of his safe space, if you want to call it that, and that cover 3 heavy system with Gus Bradley, that has me enamored by itself because I'm like, okay, well, how good is he going to be in this new type of playing? But then you think about, okay, well, he's not even the CB1, and for a team that had holes across the defense, if you could address, the corner opposite of AJ Terrell after he takes a huge step forward in year 2, okay? Who's that other corner? Oh, it's Casey Hayward, and you got him for relatively cheap in free agency on a 2-year deal? All right, I'm listening. I'm convinced, all that from a team-building perspective is also really intriguing. I don't know about his fit in the defense. I don't know if it'll totally work out, but man, if it does, if Hayward can be a solid, reliable 2 opposite of AJ Terrell, who's a superstar in the making, that helps out the likes of a Grady Jarrett, Noah Ebiketie, D'Angelo Malone, et cetera, et cetera. So full effect on the rest of that defense of the team entirely, and better cornerback play. Maybe that helps Richie Grant as well, and maybe that mentorship is really what Grant's looking for. I play different positions. I can't speak to that necessarily. I'm obviously not in that building, but it's just interesting to add this guy especially when you look at it, and it's not a perfect scheme fit. What was the need and what was the value that Atlanta really saw they were getting? I don't know, but he's a good football player, and if it works, that's a really nice 1-2 punch there in his secondary that has struggled for plenty of years now until, AJ Terrell kind of broke onto the scene last year. Games to watch, I don't think I mentioned this in the Cardinals video, and that's on my fault. But I don't include division games in these because, division games are important. It's just kind of counterintuitive. So I leave division games out of these games to watch. These are 3 more that I think are important. Just like in X Factors, I don't include superstars, right? Like we know Grady Jarrett's good. He's not an X Factor. He's just a good player. So that point aside, first 2 games I think have a common thread, winnable. Falcons taking on 2 teams in week 3 and then week 11 that many would perceive in the bottom 4th of the league, the bottom barrel as I call it. So hitting the road against Seattle, it's also interesting. Week 3 in Seattle, week 13 versus Pittsburgh. Part of my rationale for picking these games is how big of a step forward this team take. How much better did you get from week 3 to week 13, or really overall week 1 to the end of the regular season in this team's case? So that's always an interesting kind of task for me to kind of sort out, and I play it into effect here in the games to watch. But week 3 of the year at Seattle, 2 teams that are bottom of the barrel, likely picking at the top of the first round next year. But that being said, it's interesting to see what this young team, how do they handle going all across the country? That's interesting. Do they look sluggish? Do they come out hard to play? How's this team feeling about Arthur Smith? I know it's early in the season, but year 1 wasn't necessarily great. 7 wins is good, but the point differential, that feels like it takes a larger toll in a lot of ways. But there's some intrigue there. And then you move on to week 11 again, a team that I think comparable to one another, weaker teams. The Bears are a little bit of an opposite to the Falcons in my eyes, just because I look at Atlanta and I'm not certain about that quarterback position, but there's things in the roster that I like. Then for Chicago, it's almost not necessarily the complete opposite, but I look at Justin Fields and I'm like, number 3 player on my draft board that year. Obviously, I'm a big fan. I think there's something to work with there. But then the rest of the roster feels kind of desolate. No disrespect to Bears fans, and they're patching up that offensive line now, bringing in a guy like Riley Reef. But because of that, similar points in the NFL, but different looking rosters, and that's just kind of interesting. But again, a game they can win, which if you win 3 games this year and 2 of them come on this list, then, hey, they were games to watch. And then week 13 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So this is one where I kind of want to see both a potential weakness on that Falcons offense and then a potential strength. So the weakness being Pittsburgh, known for their pass rush. TJ Watt's the reigning defensive player of the year. Cam Hayward seems to get better year over year. Lose Stephon Tuitt, but Larry Ogunjobi comes in, fills that spot. This is a team that knows how to get pressure, and they're probably going to be good at it again this year. So what does that mean for that Falcons offensive line? And plus, this is week 13, but the rust excuse is gone by the wind at this point. So assuming the unit is mostly healthy by week 13, how does Caleb McGarry hold up in his pass rush sets against a TJ Watt if he gets matched up? Or how does Jalen Mayfield, does he keep his lunchbox, or does Cam Hayward eat this kid alive? We'll find out. So be interesting to see some of the growth and from some of those weak points across that offensive line, and where I think the Falcons do have a strength and maybe stay close in this game, which Pittsburgh could be a bottom of the barrel team too if Kenny Pickett and Mitch Trubisky are really rough. So there's nothing saying this could be another one of those common thread weaker opponent games. But Pittsburgh's secondary not great, and they're all kind of small, right? Ahkello Witherspoon maybe a little bit more length, but Levi Wallace right around 6 foot, and then Cam Sutton a little short. But I look at this wide receiver room in Atlanta, and it just makes me think that they'll find games against bad secondaries. They'll just be able to stick around. I don't know if they'll necessarily be quote-unquote competitive, but they'll be able to stick around, put up some points. And I think this Pittsburgh one, despite that pressure that the Steelers can bring, it may not take long for you to take advantage of, Drake London against Cam Sutton, right? And even if it's not necessarily him getting open off the route, it's just that size. So I don't know. That matchup between a weak cornerback group and some promising big wide receivers, and even if it's not big, Bryan Edwards, we talked about him earlier, that's kind of interesting to me, and I think that will allow, if Mariota's accurate enough, gets the ball out in time, all those sorts of things, that could keep this team in games and competitive. And, maybe even Pittsburgh has, a winning record, which Mike Tomlin seems to just do he literally has done year in and year out. Maybe they are that type of team, but I think the Falcons could be one of those squads that just keeps it close and takes advantage of that, mismanage with their wideouts versus, a team like Pittsburgh in their corner. So just a game I'm kind of interested in when it comes to matchups. But again, it's late in the year. I want to see how this team, how different do they look against the Seahawks versus the Steelers. But all that aside, let me hear what you think about the Atlanta Falcons. What's a realistic win total for this team? Who are some X factors, not superstars, but X factors, players you think could help this team exceed expectations or fall short of them? And finally, some games to watch, some matchups you're intrigued by when the Falcons take the field. Who are some opponents you think they match up well against? Love to have your thoughts down below in the comments section. Hopefully you all enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. It'll help me out a ton. If you're new right here, want to see more football content, just hit that big red subscribe button. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. And until next time, my name is Teej. I'm signing off.